I've always enjoyed long trips, that feeling of leaving behind a familiar place to explore something new. That morning was cloudy, as if the sky was just waiting for something to happen. The bus to Philadelphia left the station without much fanfare. It was just a trip, something simple, a break from the routine. I boarded the bus, my mind focused on the destination, trying to distract myself with the idea of some free time away from it all. The smell of leather and the dampness of the road welcomed me. The bus wasn't packed, but there were enough people to fill the seats around me. Most of them seemed to be in a state of quiet exhaustion, tired eyes, blank faces. There was an elderly man sitting next to me, his expression empty, lifeless. A woman with a small child sat ahead. Both looked uncomfortable, but neither dared to exchange a word. Suddenly, a strange sound, almost imperceptible, sliced through the calm. It was the driver, a man with a stern expression, who stood up and made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please pay attention to some important rules for the smooth conduct of our journey. During this trip, you will need to follow a few instructions. The first rule, starting tonight, everyone must keep their eyes closed. This is not optional. Close your eyes, please. The second, no one should ask questions of each other. Any interaction should be avoided. If not, actions will be taken according to the consequences." The first reaction was one of surprise. I looked around, trying to find some kind of explanation in the expressions of the passengers, but everyone was strangely silent. The woman with the child didn't seem surprised. She just kept staring out the window, as if the driver's words were something normal. The elderly man next to me didn't move. He seemed even more relaxed after that. The driver returned to his seat, and the bus continued its route. The low hum of the engines and the slight vibration of the wheels were all that could be heard now. The landscape outside was blurred. The weather was overcast, and it didn't take long for night to fall. Everyone on the bus began doing what the driver had asked, closing their eyes in deep silence. I, reluctantly, followed what seemed like an odd rule, but I refused to close my eyes completely. I left a small crack, just enough to see a bit of the darkness outside. The feeling of being in a confined space, with everyone following the rules without question, was unsettling. I tried to understand what was going on, but something inside me told me that the more I thought about it, the more I would lose myself in that strange journey. What was happening? Why did it seem like no one cared about the rules? Where was the normalcy? The feeling of claustrophobia slowly settled in, and all I could do was wait for the trip to end. But something told me that when we reached Philadelphia, the journey would be far from over. The night seemed endless. The bus moved along at a slow pace, the soft sound of the tires scraping against the wet asphalt. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the world, and inside the bus, the silence was absolute. Everyone had their eyes closed, as if they were in some sort of trance. I couldn't tell anymore whether it was exhaustion or tension taking over my mind, but somehow I also closed my eyes, not knowing for how long. That's when a new voice broke the silence. The driver, once again, making an announcement over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, a new rule is now in effect. Everyone must keep their eyes closed until the end of the trip. If anyone opens them, there will be consequences. Also, during the night, no passenger should communicate with others. No questions, no curious glances. Everyone must remain silent." At first, I thought it might be a joke, but there was nothing funny about the situation. The driver's tone was firm, as if those words were not suggestions but non-negotiable orders. The bus seemed to have turned into a time capsule, with each passenger stuck in a silent routine, as if they were all playing a role in a play I didn't understand. There was something unsettling about that silence. No murmurs, no movement. The elderly man next to me didn't budge. The woman with the child kept her eyes closed, her face expressionless, and the child, strangely, wasn't crying or making a sound. The absence of any emotion or reaction only heightened the sense of unease that filled the air. I glanced discreetly at the other passengers, trying to make sense of what was going on. They all seemed to have been taken over by some kind of collective apathy, as if the bus had become a psychological prison where no one could or wanted to escape. There were no questions, no laughter, no words of comfort, just closed eyes, as if each person was waiting for something, or trying to protect themselves from something. Time passed without me noticing. A strange feeling of discomfort settled in, and I began to question my decision to board this trip. I should have gotten off at the first stop. What was I doing there? The feeling of being trapped inside something so simple, yet so disturbing, grew like a silent shadow. Every second that passed seemed to drag on more slowly, as if the bus were in some kind of time distortion. That's when the child next to me, without opening her eyes, whispered, almost as if she were speaking to herself, "They can't know." I nearly jumped out of my seat. The child wasn't supposed to speak. No one was speaking. Not the adults. Not the other passengers. How did she know that? How could anyone break the rule at such a critical moment? I looked at her, but her eyes were still closed and her expression hadn't changed. The whisper seemed like a confusion of my mind, an echo of a reality that was beginning to distort. But the feeling that something more was there, something hidden, haunted me for the rest of the night. When silence took over the bus again, an idea started forming in my mind. What if those rules weren't just for our safety? What if they were part of something darker? Fear grew like a snowball inside me. I didn't know if I was becoming paranoid, or if there was truly something terribly wrong happening on this trip. But I didn't know what to do. The passengers were in a trance, following the rules like automatons, without questioning, without hesitating. I was alone, not knowing who else there was truly aware of what was going on. The night felt endless, and I knew that if the trip continued like this, something much worse was waiting. The journey continued without any major incidents, but the discomfort grew with every mile. The silence was absolute, and the only thing breaking the monotony was the sound of the bus engine, growing fainter as the darkness closed in around us. The feeling that we were being watched, or that something was waiting to happen, wouldn't let me be at ease. That's when the driver made a new announcement, interrupting the suffocating silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's a new rule in effect. During the night, no one can look at the clock. If anyone does, the trip will be stopped and everyone will be removed from the bus. If you feel the urge to check the time, close your eyes and count to 100. This is to ensure everyone stays calm and centered." I had no idea what the reasoning behind this new rule could be. What could possibly be so dangerous about looking at the clock? But the feeling that any small transgression could lead to severe consequences felt real. I looked around, trying to read the passengers' expressions. But, like before, there was nothing but blank faces. Fear was growing inside me, but there was no one to share it with. That's when I saw something strange. Near the back of the bus, in one of the most distant seats, a man with an unusual appearance seemed to be observing the other passengers. His gaze wasn't apathetic like the others. He wasn't keeping his eyes closed, nor did he seem to be following the rules. He was, in some way, disconnected from the reality that everyone else seemed to be sharing. His look seemed sorrowful, as if he knew something that no one else did. Before I could think about approaching or questioning him, he suddenly stood up, making a strange movement, as though he were crossing an invisible barrier that separated him from the others. He walked toward the driver, and for a moment, the entire bus seemed to stop breathing. The communication between them was silent, but there was a tension in the air. The driver, who had maintained his rigid and impassive posture until then, seemed unsettled, hesitating as the man whispered something I couldn't hear. I tried to observe more closely, but something inside me told me I shouldn't be paying attention to that conversation. It was as if a warning was being sent by my mind, a feeling that I should ignore what was happening, just like everyone else was doing. Suddenly, the man returned to his seat, and silence took over once again. But I noticed something even more disturbing. He wasn't alone anymore. When he sat back down, there was now a presence beside him, something that seemed to move in a subtle yet unmistakable way. The figure was indistinct, like a shadow, but the feeling that it was there watching made me shiver. Fear began to spread in a way I didn't know how to control. The rules that seemed so absurd at first now felt like a veil hiding something much darker. Something was happening there, something beyond our understanding, and I didn't know who to trust or what to do anymore. The man, the shadow beside him, the driver with his orders, it all seemed like part of a nightmare with no end. The night dragged on as if time were dilated, but I knew that at any moment, something would change. I could no longer ignore the feeling that the rules weren't just to control us, but to protect us from something far worse. And then in the middle of the trip, a scream tore through the air, coming from one of the passengers near the back. The sound wasn't human. It was a distorted, torturous scream that made my stomach churn. The silence that followed was even heavier, as if the air had squeezed itself around us, swallowing any remnants of sanity. What was happening there? And what else was on that bus that I hadn't discovered yet? The scream that echoed through the bus seemed to slice through the air with an intensity that made me shudder. That sound wasn't human. It was a mix of agony and despair, something that came from a dark and deep place. For a moment, all the passengers turned around, but no one moved. The silence, thicker than before, swallowed the scream until it became just a distant memory. But in the back of my mind, it continued to resonate, like an echo that couldn't be erased. When I finally managed to tear my eyes away from the people around me, I looked back toward the source of the sound. The man who had been sitting with a shadow beside him was now standing, his eyes wide in a state of deep shock. He wasn't screaming, but his expression was pure terror. He stared at the aisle, as if trying to understand what had just happened. Then, something bizarre happened. The passenger sitting behind him, a woman who had seemed calm and tranquil up until that point, raised her hand and gently touched his shoulder. He turned slowly, and it was then that I realized. Her eyes were completely white, with no pupils, as if she was no longer a person, but something different, something that shouldn't have been there. She murmured in a low, cavernous voice, "You shouldn't have done that. Now! The trip has a price." These words fell like a bomb in the already tense atmosphere. The woman didn't seem human. Her fingers were longer than natural, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. She looked at me for a moment, as if she realized I was there, and it was as though I was transported to another place, a place where time didn't exist. Reality twisted before my eyes. The feeling of being in a nightmare became even more intense. I wanted to scream, "Run," but something inside me held me back. I knew, somehow, that I couldn't leave without facing it. The woman smiled, a smile that was anything but human, and then, slowly, she sat back down as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The bus, which had previously seemed to be traveling toward Philadelphia, now felt as though it were in a limbo. The exterior of the window was pitch black, with no light or reference point. The world outside seemed to disappear, and all that remained was the sound of the engine, the rustling of trees that couldn't be seen but that I knew were there lurking. The driver, who had seemed indifferent to what was happening inside the bus, finally broke the silence again. "Now! Everyone must remain silent until we arrive. Any sound, any sudden movement, may result in consequences for everyone." The tension was so thick that the air seemed to be condensed. No one dared to speak. What shocked me the most wasn't the situation itself, but how everyone was reacting. They were no longer scared. They weren't in a panic. It was as if, somehow, they already knew what was coming, as if they were part of a bigger plan. The woman with the white eyes looked at me again. Her lips moved slowly, saying something I couldn't understand. But her expression, I will never forget that expression. She knew something I didn't, something that was about to be revealed. The fear I felt mixed with a strange curiosity, a need to understand what was happening. The bus kept moving forward, with no one moving, no one speaking. I knew that somehow I had crossed a line. I had entered a territory where the rules made no sense, where the journey was more of a survival test than a simple trip. The journey to Philadelphia now seemed like nothing more than a facade for something much darker, something that was beginning to reveal itself, piece by piece, as we ventured deeper and deeper into an endless void. But what was this price that everyone seemed to fear? What would happen when we reached the destination? And what exactly was happening to those passengers who seemed to follow rules beyond any human comprehension? I still didn't have the answer, but one thing was certain: I could no longer ignore the signs. I needed to find out before it was too late. The bus continued its journey through the darkness, and with every mile we covered, the feeling that we were in a place outside of time grew stronger. The engine hummed, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the sound of the real world was being filtered and distorted. Shadows seemed to dance on the windows, creating unsettling shapes, as if something was watching us from the darkness outside. And the strangest thing of all, no one seemed scared anymore. It was as if everyone had already accepted what was happening, as if the journey was part of their fate, something inevitable. My eyes fixed on the woman with the white eyes, who now seemed to be at the center of everything. She no longer spoke, but her presence dominated the environment. She stared ahead, as if waiting for something, and I couldn't take my eyes off her, feeling an invisible force urging me to understand what was happening. The other passengers, who had remained silent until then, now seemed as immersed in the journey as she was, each with their lost gaze, as if they had already lived through this. But what unsettled me the most was that at a certain point, I realized that the journey was not just altering the perception of time and space. It was messing with the mind of everyone inside. The feeling of déjà vu was inescapable, as if all the rules, all the instructions we had received up until that point, were parts of a play everyone had already watched but couldn't change the ending. And I was beginning to feel trapped in that play, not knowing how to escape. That's when the driver, who had remained in complete silence until then, made another interruption. His face, once expressionless, was now tense, almost as if he were held by some invisible force. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning each passenger, before speaking in a grave and mysterious tone. Some of you already know what's at stake. Others not yet. But everyone will have to make a choice. One of you, and only one, will be able to leave this journey. The rest, well, the rest will be part of it forever. Those words fell upon us like a sentence. There were no immediate reactions. It was as if everyone had already been expecting this. The expressions on the passengers' faces remained unchanged, as if they were preparing for something inevitable. But for me, that was the moment when the tension reached its peak. Choice. A simple word, but one loaded with terrible implications. What did this choice mean? Who would decide who gets to leave? And what would happen to those who stayed behind? The woman with the white eyes, who had been silent up until now, looked at the driver with an expression of approval. It was as if she knew more than any of us, as if the fate of the situation had already been written somehow, and no one there could change it. She slowly stood up from her seat, her movements looking more fluid and unnatural, and walked to the front of the bus, stopping right next to the driver. "The rules are clear, but no one wants to play this game," she said, her voice calm yet unsettling. She turned to face the rest of the passengers, her eyes completely white now, as if her humanity had completely vanished. "Whoever makes the choice will be the only one to escape. The rest of you will stay here with the bus forever. Until the next trip, until the next game begins." The word game echoed in my mind. What was going on? Was this some kind of competition between the passengers? Was one of us supposed to choose between all of them? And what exactly did that mean for each one of us? I knew the answers were right in front of me, but I couldn't quite process them fully. On impulse, I looked at the other passengers, trying to catch some sign in their expressions. But they all seemed so indifferent, so resigned, as if they already knew what was happening and were just waiting for the moment to act. That's when the man with the shadow, who seemed like the most normal of all, stood up slowly. His expression was that of someone who had made a decision. He looked at the woman with white eyes and spoke, his voice trembling, but with a strange sense of resolve. "I can't live with this. I choose." The driver looked at him, and for a brief moment, the bus stopped, making my heart race. It was like time had frozen for a second. Then, the driver nodded and a low, lifeless laugh escaped from the woman with the white eyes. She moved closer to him, and with an almost imperceptible gesture, touched his forehead. He stiffened as if in a trance, and suddenly, his expression became blank. He was staring into nothingness. She touched him one last time, and he slumped back, sitting down again in his seat, but his presence seemed to vanish. He was an empty shell now. And then, everyone finally turned to me, waiting for my choice. I knew that by making my choice, I would be risking my own life. But what would happen to the others? Were they just waiting for the end, or did they have something to lose to? What would happen to the journey, to the bus, once the choice was made? The feeling that everything was about to unravel began to consume my thoughts, but I knew I didn't have time to hesitate anymore. The journey was nearing its end, and I had to decide. I felt my body paralyzed by the tension. The passengers' gazes were on me, cold and empty, as if they already knew what my choice would be. The man in the shadow had become an empty shell, and with that, the feeling that time was running out intensified with every passing second. I could hear the muffled hum of the engine, the whisper of the wheels on the asphalt, as if the bus itself was breathing, waiting for something. But what? What would happen once I made my choice? The silence inside the bus became deafening, as if the air was charged with something electric, ready to explode. I looked at the driver, who was watching me with a neutral expression, but there was something in his eyes, like he knew I couldn't escape the decision that lay ahead. He didn't say a word, but his eyes conveyed a clear warning. The choice is yours, but it won't be easy. The woman with the white eyes, now motionless beside the driver, observed everything with a terrifying calm. She seemed to know what was coming, as if this moment was part of something much bigger, something that transcended simple logic. I wanted to scream, ask what was happening, beg for an explanation, but a part of me knew that words no longer mattered. I was trapped in this game, and the time to escape had already passed. A wave of heat swept over my body, and a faint but persistent voice began to form in my mind. It was as if someone was whispering directly into my head, a voice that blended with the sound of the engine, like a distant echo. Choose. Choose before it's too late. You know what you need to do. At first, I tried to ignore the voice, but it grew louder. With every word, my body seemed to react, a growing sense of urgency building within me. And then everything made sense. I wasn't here by accident. The bus wasn't just a means of transportation. It was a trap, and the rules were designed to keep us stuck. The passengers, we were all here for a reason, and the choice was part of the game but not the end. I remembered the first rules the driver had given. No one can leave until the game ends. But what would happen if no one chose? And what did it mean to end the game? The woman with the white eyes seemed to have all the answers, but she wasn't willing to share them. She wanted to see who would have the courage to make the decision, who would choose freedom, who would risk everything to try to escape. I took a deep breath and looked at the other passengers. Each one of them seemed lost in their own thoughts, as if they were in a state of acceptance, as if they knew their choices had already been made long before they boarded this bus. I didn't want to be like them. I didn't want to be like the man in the shadows, who was now just empty. My gaze shifted back to the woman. She seemed to be daring me to do something, to take action. I knew deep down she wasn't offering me an escape. She was testing me. The bus was testing me. Then, suddenly, the feeling hit me that the bus wasn't moving anymore. The silence that followed was profound, as if the world had stopped turning. There was no more sound of the wheels on the asphalt, no more hum of the engine. The bus was stationary, somewhere in the void, and all that remained was a choice. The only choice I had. What would happen if I said no? What would happen if I refused to be part of this game? My mind was on fire, each possibility clashing with the other. But deep down, one thing was clear. I couldn't turn back now. It was now or never. I stood up, sweat dripping down my forehead, and took a step toward the woman with the white eyes. She didn't move, but her presence seemed to grow, as if an invisible force was pulling me toward her. The driver remained silent, waiting. Finally, I spoke, my voice trembling but firm. "I choose." The woman smiled, a cruel smile that made my heart race. She raised her hand, and as if it were a silent command, the lights on the bus went out all at once. The darkness spread like ink, swallowing everything around me. I felt like I was being pulled into a hole, gravity dragging me toward nothingness. And then, a voice, cold as the biting wind of the night, whispered in my mind, "You chose, but now you pay the price." Suddenly, the light returned, brighter than ever. I was back in my seat, the bus moving again, but something was wrong. There were no more passengers. The driver was no longer at the wheel. And the most terrifying thing of all, I was alone. The woman with the white eyes had vanished, along with everyone else. I was on the same bus, but on a destination that was no longer Philadelphia. I knew, with absolute certainty, that my choice had changed everything. The bus was no longer taking me home. It was taking me to a much darker place. And then at the back of the bus, in an empty seat, a shadow began to form. I knew the game wasn't over yet. I was still trapped on the bus. But now something even darker was taking over the atmosphere. The lights flickered, intermittently failing, as if the bus itself was fighting against an invisible force trying to pull it somewhere far away. The sound of the engine, once steady, was now quieter, almost like a sigh. The silence on the bus was heavy, as if something was lurking, watching. My eyes locked onto the shadow that had appeared at the back of the bus. It was slowly taking shape, becoming humanoid, but it wasn't a figure I recognized. It was more like a distortion, a presence that seemed to absorb all the light around it. There was no definition, just blurry edges, as if it was something trying to hide from my perception. Yet, I knew it was there. I knew it was watching me. I stood up, every muscle in my body rebelling against the idea of moving. Something deep inside screamed for me to stay where I was, not to draw attention to the shadow, not to provoke whatever that thing was. But, like an involuntary reflex, I walked toward it. As I got closer, the air around me thickened. The space inside the bus felt compressed, like the atmosphere was pressing in on me. Every step I took seemed to make the shadow grow larger, like I was getting closer to a black hole, a force that wanted to swallow me whole. I knew there was no turning back now. If I looked behind me, I wouldn't be able to return to what was familiar. The bus, the journey, everything felt so far away. I stopped just a few feet from the shadow. What happened next surprised me. The figure didn't move, but its presence was enough to wash over me with a wave of desperation. It didn't speak, but something inside me knew it was waiting for me to do something. Maybe a reaction, maybe just a gesture. Suddenly, the shadow took shape, as if the air around it condensed, revealing a human-like figure, but distorted. Its eyes were like black holes, swallowing all the light around them. The skin looked melted, as if made of something fluid, something that didn't belong to this world. And once again, it didn't speak. But there was something in its presence that made me understand. It was the end. The game was over. I knew the decision I had made earlier had brought me here. The choice to choose had been the key that unlocked this place. But what was this place? A prison? A place where those who failed their choices were taken to pay a price? Or was it just the beginning of something even worse? The shadow, now fully formed, moved toward me without making a sound. Its empty eyes seemed to search for something deep within my soul, something I had lost. The feeling of being devoured by it, not physically but psychologically, was overwhelming. It was as if it were trying to tear away the last remnants of my humanity, of my essence. Then, the figure leaned in, and its words were whispered directly into my mind, like poison seeping through my veins. You thought you had escaped, didn't you? That the choice was the end. But the choice, it's only the beginning. The air turned cold, freezing, as if the temperature inside the bus had dropped drastically. The sensation of being out of control grew more intense. The shadow began to fade, as if it was dissipating into the air, but with each passing second, I could feel it binding to me, becoming a part of me. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but something held me back. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. My mind clouded by a sense of not belonging, as if everything around me was an illusion. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know if I was still inside the bus. I didn't know if I was still alive. I didn't know what was real anymore. Then, the shadow's words returned, clearer this time. But now, there was something more to them, something that seemed to come from deep inside my own being. You chose to stay. Now you're part of this. Part of the bus. Part of the game. I looked around, and what I saw made no sense. The interior of the bus was distorted. The passengers now mere vague figures, their faces blurred as if they were dissolving into reality. The bus, which once seemed like an ordinary machine, was now wrapped in a dark aura, as if it were a portal to something beyond. The destination to Philadelphia no longer mattered. What mattered was that I was trapped here forever. I tried to fight against the overwhelming sense of despair that enveloped me, but it was as if my mind was being crushed under the weight of understanding. I had made the choice, and now I was stuck in this eternal cycle with the other passengers who had made the same choice, all of us trapped on the same bus, heading toward a destination we could not comprehend. The driver, the man in the shadows, the woman with white eyes, they were all disappearing, merging into the darkness. I knew there was no escape anymore. I had chosen, and the choice had led me to a place where there was no salvation. The light flickered one last time, and then everything went dark.